You know, we've talked a lot about Bill 96, about the people, of course, they'll be directed or affected directly by it, and we're still not sure how that's ultimately going to play out. But I came across this story and thought to myself, okay, so we know about Indigenous peoples and the issue they have with the Quebec government on this, but what specifically about the Jewish community? I had not thought of this story. I see MARVIN ROTRAND, who's National Director of the League for Human Rights with B'nai Brith Canada, sent this information along. And by the way, Marvin, am I correct? B'nai Brith today made public its opposition to Bill 96?
Press conference today in which many leaders of the Jewish community were present, but so were a lot of leaders of Asian and Black community organizations, because they feel that our arguments apply to them as well, particularly in terms of who's an Anglophone and who will get access to services going forward.
So what are the issues here that affect this community as opposed to all others? Yes, you're mentioning others, but what's the specific issue here?
Well, the Jewish community has Quebec. The first congregation was in Montreal in 1768. That's more than 250 years ago. And that congregation, by the way, still exists. It's a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Snowdon. That's its current location. And the community has contributed to the growth of Quebec and the prosperity of Quebec. In fact, Quebec, when it was called Lower Canada, was one of the first places in the Western world to accord full and equal civil rights to Jews, passing the Hard Act of 1830 and the Emancipation Act of 1832, which gave Jews the vote and the ability to practice their religions and practice every other profession in the province like anyone else. Why that was not yet recognized in Europe. Jews have had unwritten rights in the historic Constitution of Canada, which was an unwritten constitution. And our rights have been recognized through successive legislation. We're worried now that there may be an exodus of young Jews, in particular, out of the province. We've seen that before. In the 1970s, there were 125,000 Jews in Quebec. Almost 35,000 of them left. Most of them went to Toronto in the 70s and early 80s. So they've contributed to the growth of Toronto rather than the growth of Quebec. The community stabilized, and now it's about 90,000 people, but it's a different type of community. It's more elderly than Jewish communities elsewhere, and as well, it is a community that's more diverse. A lot of the community comes from the former Soviet Union, Russian Jews, Ukrainian Jews, those from Kazakhstan and elsewhere. And under the new law, they're worried. They will not access services they've had for decades in English. Their first language is not English or French. It's something else, usually Ukrainian or Russian. And they speak English as a second language. And sometimes when they go for health care, they speak to their health care provider in their native tongue, particularly if they go to the Jewish General Hospital, which, despite public hospital, has a historic affiliation with the Jewish community, founded by the Jewish community, attracts many healthcare professionals who reflect the diversity in the Jewish community and can provide services in many languages. So we estimate that nearly a third of our community will not be considered Anglophone under the law. Why? Because they weren't educated in English here in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada. And that includes Americans as well. There's a large number of American Jews living in Montreal who are married to Canadians, who went to school in the United States. That's particularly true in the Orthodox Jewish community, the Hasidic Jewish community. That, according to our interpretation of the law, will lose their rights. And that probably explains why leaders of other communities came to support what we were saying today. They feel the same sort of way. But there are other things, Aaron, in the law that cause the Jewish community, which we had previously alerted the government of Quebec and which they chose not to respond to.
See, it's this not to respond to, and this is the same sort of thing that the Indigenous communities are bringing up. It's not a matter of saying, well, how can we work this out? It's simply a matter of ignoring groups that are coming to the government and getting nowhere.
Yeah, well, that's exactly our feeling as well. First of all, we don't see the law as particularly welcoming or encouraging people to speak more French, learn French, feel part of a Francophone collectivity. We see the law as basically attacking existing rights. First of all, we see the law as a sledgehammer that is almost unprecedented in Canadian history. The notwithstanding clause has existed since 1982. But when it was adopted, it was clearly stated at the time it's supposed to be used rarely and narrowly. Ontario, I think, has used it once, and Alberta used it once or twice, and in one case, the Supreme Court overturned its use of the notwithstanding clause. Quebec's used it an awful lot, and usually for certain parts of a law, not the entire law. Well, this law takes away every democratic guarantee that any Canadian takes as for granted as part of our Canadian values, and that includes Quebecers as well. Taking away everything from, protection against reasonable search and seizure, the ability to have an interpreter in the courtroom if you don't understand the proceedings. Everything is wiped out that could possibly be wiped out by the use of the notwithstanding clause. We happen to think that Quebec's overreached. Our interpretation is that there's infringement on the Canadian Constitution in areas that are language rights, which are not areas you can use the notwithstanding clause. As well, we also feel that Quebec has almost nuanced the Canadian Charter of Rights, and that we think that's a power-only parliament, and the amending formula of 7 provinces and 50% of the Canadian population can change. But our main concerns are practical, and that number one is access. Who can get services, particularly for health care for a community that's aging? And second of all, our concerns are, again, practical. The community doesn't have a large enough basin to be able to produce quality clergy and teachers for seminaries and rabbinical colleges. By the way, the community is far more religious than when I was a youth or you were, Aaron. The Jewish community has a lot of people who wear kippahs these days, and already there's some hesitation in the community about its future in Quebec when young people are being told they can't work as civil servants or health care and pursue the law in pleading in front of courts. Can't be police officers, can't be this, can't be that, because they wear a kippah. And people should never be put in the situation where they have to decide between their deeply held beliefs and getting a job. And in fact, everywhere else in North America, the trend is the opposite.
Right.
Long-held barriers are falling away. Police departments, civil services, law societies, everyone is removing petty impediments that prevented candidates who wore a religious symbol, be it a kippah or a turban or a hijab, from getting the job if they're the best candidate and they qualify. So Bill 21 already has caused some concern in our community. And now with this, what we fear is the exodus we saw in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, might happen again. And in our community, we need our young people here. Their future has to be here in Quebec. And if it's not in Quebec, we truly fear that our community is going to fritter away. So let's get back to rabbis and teachers in seminaries and at the rabbinical colleges. Beforehand, our congregations would go and try to seek candidates in the United States, the UK, occasionally Israel or Australia. And as part of the package where we're competing against other provinces and Jewish communities in the United States, it wasn't just a question of money. We, pitch quality of life and, the Montreal je ne sais quoi, but we had to tell those candidates that their kids could go to English Jewish schools. And there was a way to do that. There was an exception to Bill 101. They got 3-year exception or exemption, and that was renewable. So it would cover usually the schooling of the child while the rabbi might temporarily be in Quebec, usually for 5-6 years. Under the current law, under Bill 96, that's been reduced to 2 years, and it is not renewable. And we're already hearing from synagogues and from rabbinical colleges, of which there are several in Montreal, that they've had candidates back out just because of that, because we cannot assure them that their kids can go to school in English at a Jewish religious school. Yeah. And that's going to be a major problem going forward. And, we are also worried about how wedding certificates are going to be issued in the future. CTV had a story on Friday about wedding certificates, at least for civil weddings, being in French only going forward. You may not know this, and your listeners may not know this, but Montreal has become a huge wedding destination for Jews from the United States, particularly from the Orthodox and Hasidic communities. And there are many synagogues in Montreal, particularly West End Montreal, that make a lot of their revenue off having weddings here. Just like in seminaries and rabbinical colleges, students from the United States tend to want to come here because it's cheaper than similar seminaries and rabbinical colleges in the United States. Often the wedding is cheaper here, and that's been a factor in attracting people. But if they can't get their certificate in English because of Bill 96, they're basically telling them, you can have your wedding here, but then you're going to have it notarized in the U.S.
Right.
And it could be a significant cost.
No, and listen, that's a problem, of course, across the board. We talked about this last week, the wedding certificate issue, but over and above what else you described, Marvin, we're out of time. I just, I wonder if the government is actually starting to listen as more and more groups point out the problems in this bill. Perhaps, I want to be kind and say the government didn't anticipate that these would be problems when it introduced this, but I'm not sure that would be the truth. But Marvin,
I'll conclude with one statement. We're willing to talk to the government of Quebec. We haven't decided whether we're going to sue them, but we're more than willing to engage with them if they will listen to us. At the very least, some amendments can blunt the worst aspects of Bill 96.
Let's hope that's the case. Marvin, I thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
You're welcome, man.
Take good care.
You for having me.
You bet.